She was born to be one of an empire's most valuable assets. As a Habsburg daughter, her lineage was considered the purest in Europe, and her future was to secure royal power through a strategic marriage. Instead, she died in agony at age 4, her small body ravaged by uncontrollable epileptic convulsions. Her name was Archduchess Maria Anna of Austria. Why did a royal child surrounded by luxury and the best medical care of her era die so tragically and painfully? The answer doesn't lie in random illness, it lies in the very pure bloodline her family worshipped. Today we explore the tragic life of Maria Anna. It's a name many may not recognize, but her 4 short years on earth offer an incredibly poignant window into the hidden costs of power, dynasty, and the relentless pursuit of pure bloodlines by one of history's most dominant families, the Habsburgs. Imagine, if you will, the opulent world of the 19th century Austrian Empire, a realm of grand palaces, intricate court etiquette, and a social hierarchy as rigid as the diamonds on an empress's gown. In this world, a child born into the imperial family was not just a baby, they were a living symbol, a vessel for dynastic hopes and political ambitions. Every birth was an event, a continuation of a legacy, a potential future monarch, or a strategic pawn in the complex game of European power. It was into this gilded cage, this world of immense privilege and equally immense expectation, that Maria Anna arrived. Born on October 27, 1835, Maria Anna was the daughter of Archduke Franz Karl of Austria and Princess Sophie of Bavaria. Her lineage was impeccable, a direct thread woven into the very heart of the Habsburg dynasty, a family whose name alone conjured images of imperial might and centuries of unbroken rule. To be born a Habsburg was to be born into a destiny preordained by generations of strategic marriages, territorial acquisitions, and a firm belief in their divine right to govern vast swathes of Europe. From the sun-drenched plains of Spain to the mountainous heartlands of Austria, their influence was undeniable, their reach almost unfathomable. This was not merely a royal family. It was an institution, a brand, a political enterprise that had shaped the continent's destiny for half a millennium. Their famous motto, Bella gerant ali, tu felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, wasn't just a proud declaration. It was a testament to their unique and highly effective strategy of empire building through matrimonial alliances. They understood that a well-placed marriage could achieve what armies might fail to secure, and often without the bloody cost. This strategy, however, while undeniably successful in consolidating power and expanding influence, carried with it a devastating, often invisible price that would be paid, ironically, by the very bloodline they sought to preserve. Maria Anna's early death on February 13, 1840, at the tender age of 4, is more than just a tragic footnote in a lengthy genealogical record. It's a stark, undeniable testament to the fragility of life when hereditary vulnerabilities are amplified through generations of careful, yet ultimately self-destructive marital practices. Her short life, barely a flicker in the grand narrative of the Habsburgs, serves as a profoundly moving and deeply unsettling case study. It forces us to confront the harsh reality that beneath the glittering surface of imperial power and aristocratic grandeur lay a disturbing vulnerability, a genetic ticking time bomb that often manifested in the most heartbreaking way, through the suffering and early demise of innocent children. Her story, therefore, becomes a microcosm, a singular, poignant example of a much larger, more tragic theme we will explore today: the price of pure bloodlines. It's a narrative that connects her fragile existence to other, more infamous Habsburg figures, demonstrating a chilling pattern of dynastic decline and individual suffering directly linked to the consequences of extreme inbreeding. To truly appreciate the weight of Maria Anna's story, we must first immerse ourselves in the intricate tapestry of the Habsburg world into which she was born. The year 1835 found the Austrian Empire under the reign of her grandfather, Emperor Franz I. It was a time of conservative reaction across Europe, following the tumultuous Napoleonic Wars. The architect of this conservative order was the formidable Prince Metternich, who virtually ran the empire's foreign policy and exerted enormous influence domestically. The empire itself was a vast multi-ethnic mosaic encompassing Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Italians, and many others, all held together by the glue of the Habsburg crown. Vienna, the imperial capital, was a glittering hub of culture, music, and intellectual life, but beneath the surface, profound social and political tensions simmered, soon to erupt in the revolutionary fervor of 1848. Maria Anna's immediate family was at the heart of this complex world. Her father, Archduke Franz Karl, was the second son of Emperor Franz I. He was a rather unassuming figure, described by many as gentle, kind, but lacking the intellectual rigor or ambition for truly significant political roles. He preferred a quieter life, away from the intense pressures of governing. This perhaps stemmed from a mild disposition, or as some historians subtly hint, a certain intellectual dullness that might itself have been a consequence of the family's genetic heritage. He was certainly not the dynamic, decisive leader the empire often required. Her mother, Princess Sophie of Bavaria, was a woman of an entirely different mold. Described as beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, and strong-willed, Sophie was often considered the only man at court. She possessed a sharp political mind and was acutely aware of the importance of dynasty and succession. She harbored significant ambitions for her children, particularly her eldest son, Franz Joseph, who would later become one of the longest reigning emperors in Habsburg history. Sophie's strength and determination were legendary, and she often compensated for her husband's passive nature. She was the driving force behind many family decisions, a formidable presence whose intelligence and charm captivated those around her, including her brother-in-law, the Duke of Reichstadt, with whom she developed a famously close, albeit platonic, relationship. It's within this dynamic between Franz Karl's mildness and Sophie's formidable intelligence that Maria Anna's brief story unfolds. She was their third child following Franz Joseph and Ferdinand Max, who would later become Emperor of Mexico. They would also have another son, Karl Ludwig, before Maria Anna. Her birth was undoubtedly met with the usual courtly fanfare, a new addition to the seemingly endless lineage of Habsburgs, another potential link in the chain of power. But beneath the celebrations, the unspoken genetic vulnerabilities continued their insidious work. The reason Maria Anna's short life holds such a powerful, almost emblematic significance lies precisely in this underlying, often tragic, truth. She embodies the devastating consequences of Habsburg inbreeding practices. Her story isn't just about a single child. It's about a systemic issue that plagued one of the world's most powerful dynasties. The Habsburgs' obsession with maintaining what they perceived as pure bloodlines and consolidating political power through marital alliances led them down a perilous genetic path. They frequently engaged in consanguineous marriages, meaning unions between close relatives. This wasn't just an occasional occurrence. It was a sustained, generations-long strategy. First cousins married first cousins, uncles married nieces, and occasionally Even more intimate relationships were established through complex family trees that overlapped and intertwined in bewildering fashion. Maria Anna's parents, Franz Karl and Sophie, were second cousins. While a first cousin marriage might not immediately trigger alarm bells in all genetic contexts, within the Habsburg lineage it was just one more link in a long, unbroken chain of similar unions stretching back centuries. Each such marriage further amplified the likelihood of offspring inheriting two copies of the same recessive, often harmful genes, one from each parent. Think of it like this. Every human carries a small number of recessive genes that, if inherited from both parents, can cause serious health issues. Usually, if your parents are unrelated, the chances of both carrying the exact same harmful recessive gene are low. But when parents are closely related, they share a significant portion of their genetic material, dramatically increasing the probability of both carrying and passing on the same recessive genes. This genetic vulnerability, accumulated over generations, increased the risk of a wide array of congenital disorders. While the Habsburgs enjoyed immense wealth and access to the best medical care of their time, a stark contrast to the common populace, even the most attentive physicians were helpless against the fundamental laws of genetics. The issue wasn't a lack of care, but an inherent, inescapable biological predisposition. The common conditions linked to this intense inbreeding in the Habsburgs included physical deformities, weakened immune systems making them susceptible to common illnesses, and crucially, a significantly higher rate of infant and child mortality. Maria Anna's early death, at an age when many children of her social standing would be thriving, tragically fits this pattern, underscoring the dynasty's gradual, yet undeniable, genetic decline. Her story isn't merely a piece of genealogical trivia. It serves as a compelling and accessible case study, allowing us to connect the abstract scientific concepts of genetics and inheritance to a very real, very human tragedy. It allows us to explore the broader theme of the price of pure bloodlines, not just theoretically, but through the lens of a specific vulnerable individual. Moreover, Maria Anna's brief existence provides a vital link to other, more widely recognized Habsburg figures whose lives were profoundly shaped by these same genetic forces. Her fate foreshadows, or at least reinforces, the tragic narrative of figures like Charles II of Spain, whose physical and mental disabilities were so severe that he became a living testament to the dangers of extreme inbreeding. And it echoes the struggles of individuals like Don Carlos, the son of Philip II of Spain, whose mental instability and erratic behavior were often attributed, at least in part, to the pervasive genetic issues within his royal lineage. These aren't isolated incidents. They are chapters in a continuous unfolding narrative of dynastic vulnerability, with Maria Anna's story offering a heartbreaking yet illuminating perspective. It's a powerful narrative that highlights how even the most powerful families are ultimately bound by the immutable laws of biology. The decision-making process behind these elaborate and risky marital strategies was complex, rooted in centuries of geopolitical reality and a deeply ingrained aristocratic worldview. For the Habsburgs, their vast empire was not a homogeneous entity, but a collection of disparate lands, languages, and cultures held together by the person of the monarch. Maintaining this sprawling dominion required constant vigilance and a sophisticated network of alliances. Marriage was the ultimate diplomatic tool, a way to forge unbreakable bonds between ruling houses, prevent wars, and secure successions. When a Habsburg princess married into another royal family, she brought not just a dowry, but a guarantee of alliance, a commitment to shared interests. Conversely, when a foreign princess married into the Habsburg fold, she brought new territories, new claims, or at the very least, a powerful ally against rival powers like France or the Ottoman Empire. The concept of dynastic purity was equally crucial. In an age where monarchs claimed divine right, the purity of their bloodline was seen as a validation of their legitimacy and a source of their inherent authority. Mixing royal blood with that of lesser families was often viewed with suspicion as potentially weakening the monarch's claim or even tainting the sacred essence of kingship. This belief was not unique to the Habsburgs, but they embraced it with an almost religious zeal. This intertwined drive for political advantage and perceived purity led them to prefer marrying within their own, already interconnected family network. They saw their cousins, nieces, and nephews not just as relatives, but as ideal partners who would strengthen the existing power structure and keep the wealth and influence firmly within the Habsburg orbit. The idea of reaching further afield for a spouse, while sometimes necessary, was often seen as a risk, potentially introducing rival claims or diluting the family's concentrated power. This strategy, while initially yielding immense political dividends, began to show its darker side as the generations wore on. The genetic consequences, initially subtle, became progressively more pronounced. Each generation of consanguineous marriage increased the probability of inheriting two copies of a harmful recessive gene. If both parents carried the same recessive gene for a particular condition, there was a 25% chance that each child would inherit two copies and manifest the condition. Over centuries, this probability mounted, transforming from a rare occurrence to an increasingly common and tragic reality for the Habsburg family. The gene pool became smaller, less diverse, making the family susceptible to a host of inherited conditions. For Maria Anna's generation, this genetic burden was significant. Her parents, Franz Karl and Sophie, were second cousins. Her paternal grandparents, Emperor Franz I and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, were also first cousins. Her maternal grandparents, King Maximilian I Joseph of Bavaria and Caroline of Baden, were not first cousins, but they were related, albeit more distantly. However, tracing the lineage further back reveals a dizzying array of interconnectedness. This cumulative effect meant that by the time Maria Anna was born, the Habsburg bloodline had become a dense tapestry of repeated genetic material, making her profoundly vulnerable. The specific genetic records for Maria Anna are not available in a modern sense, but historical accounts from the period, combined with later scientific studies of the Habsburg lineage, paint a clear picture of an aristocracy suffering from the biological cost of its own chosen path. The health challenges were varied, but certain patterns emerged. The Habsburg jaw is the most visually striking and often cited example. This distinctive facial deformity, characterized by an elongated lower jaw and often a prominent nose, can be traced through many Habsburg portraits. While not directly life-threatening, it was an outward sign of the genetic consolidation. More critically, however, were the internal vulnerabilities, weakened immune systems, higher rates of stillbirths, infant mortality, and children who failed to thrive past early childhood. Developmental delays, learning difficulties, and various physical ailments were also commonly observed. These weren't isolated cases, they were recurring features in the family's health history, becoming more prevalent and severe with each passing century of inbreeding. Maria Anna's fate was, tragically, just another iteration of this established yet often ignored pattern. The court physicians of the 19th century, despite their best efforts and considerable knowledge for the era, lacked any understanding of modern genetics. They would have attributed the various ailments to frail constitution, weakness of the humors, or even bad air. They could treat symptoms, offer comforting remedies, and ensure the children were kept warm and well fed, but they couldn't address the fundamental biological predisposition that made Maria Anna, and so many like her, inherently susceptible to illness. The irony is bitter. While the Habsburgs could command the finest medical minds in Europe, their children were often fighting a battle they were pre-programmed to lose, a battle against their own inherited biology. Maria Anna was a child born into immense privilege, yet her experience underscores the universal truth that wealth and status offer no immunity from biological realities. Her life, though cut tragically short, resonates with a deeper pathos precisely because it was lived within the gilded cage of imperial grandeur. Imagine the lavish nurseries, the retinue of nannies, wet nurses, and attendants, all dedicated to the care of these precious royal infants. Yet despite all this attention and luxury, the invisible genetic clock ticked relentlessly. Her death was not just a family sorrow. It was a subtle yet significant reminder to the court of the inherent vulnerabilities that lay beneath the surface of their seemingly invincible dynasty. Each child lost was a crack in the facade, a whisper of the impending decline that would, in later generations, become an undeniable roar. The early death of a child, even in an era of higher child mortality, was always a profound sorrow. For a royal family, it carried additional layers of disappointment and anxiety about the succession. Maria Anna was a girl, so her loss didn't directly impact the immediate line of succession to the Austrian throne. However, every royal child represented a potential future alliance, a safeguard against extinction, or a valuable piece in the elaborate diplomatic puzzle of European politics. Her passing, therefore, was not merely a personal grief for her parents. It was a loss to the dynastic potential of the entire House of Habsburg. It further cemented the unsettling pattern of fragile health within the family, adding to the growing statistical evidence of their genetic predicament. This makes Maria Anna's story a particularly powerful tool for exploring these complex themes. She is a figure through whom we can understand how the abstract concept of genetics translates into real, heartbreaking human experience. Her innocence, her lack of agency, makes her an especially sympathetic figure. She was simply born into a genetic legacy not of her choosing, a legacy that ultimately dictated the brevity of her life. Her narrative allows us to bridge the gap between historical fact and emotional impact, making the scientific and political consequences of inbreeding tangible and deeply affecting. By contrasting her brief, vulnerable existence with the immense power and opulence of the Habsburg court, we highlight a profound irony that the very strategies employed to maintain imperial grandeur ultimately undermine the biological vitality of the imperial family itself. This serves as a stark warning, a cautionary tale echoing through history about the unintended and often devastating consequences of human ambition when it disregards the fundamental laws of nature. This vast, opulent, yet genetically imperiled world provides the stage for Maria Anna's short life. To understand the personal cost of this dynastic obsession, we must move from the general to the specific, stepping inside the gilded nurseries of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna to trace the 4 short years of Maria Anna's life, a life whose story is not one of actions, but of existence, a poignant testament to the profound personal cost of a dynastic obsession. On October 27, 1835, when Archduchess Maria Anna was born, the atmosphere in the imperial court was likely one of complex, layered emotions. She was the fourth child, and significantly, the first daughter born to Archduke Franz Karl and Archduchess Sophie. Her three older brothers, Franz Joseph, Ferdinand Maximilian, and Karl Ludwig, were, by all accounts, healthy and thriving. They were the spare heirs, securing the line of succession and fulfilling the dynasty's primary objective. The birth of a daughter, therefore, might have been met with a particular kind of joy. A daughter was not just a child, she was a future political asset, a potential bride for another great European house, a living embodiment of the Habsburgs' most successful motto, Happy Austria, Marry. For her mother, the ambitious and politically astute Sophie, the birth of a daughter may have held special significance. While her focus was undeniably on grooming her eldest son, Franz Joseph, for the imperial throne, a daughter offered a different kind of dynastic influence. Sophie, herself a Wittelsbach princess from Bavaria, understood perfectly the role of a well-placed archduchess. Yet beneath this veneer of dynastic calculation, there was also the simple human joy of a mother welcoming her first girl. We can imagine the lavish gifts, the carefully prepared layette, the procession of court officials offering their congratulations. But given the family's history, given the whispers in the corridors, the stillbirths, and the children who failed to thrive in previous generations, an unspoken anxiety must have lingered in the air. A collective breath held, waiting to see if this child, too, would prove to be one of the strong ones. The imperial nurseries, housed within the vast Habsburg complex, were worlds unto themselves. They were run with military precision, staffed by a small army of Aja, nursemaids, wet nurses, and physicians. Every aspect of a royal child's life was regimented, from feeding schedules to daily walks in the palace gardens. It was an environment of immense privilege, but also one of profound isolation from the outside world. For Maria Anna, these first few years would have been spent in the company of her nurses and occasionally her parents and brothers. Sophie, despite her reputation as a Kaisermacher and her deep involvement in court politics, was by 19th century aristocratic standards a relatively attentive mother. She oversaw her children's education and well-being closely, a fact that would later make Maria Anna's fate all the more devastating for her. In these early years, from 1835 to 1837, any signs of frailty might have been subtle, perhaps dismissed as the normal sensitivities of a young child. But as Maria Anna grew from an infant into a toddler, a stark contrast between her and her robust, boisterous older brothers likely became impossible to ignore. While they were charging through the palace halls, she may have been quieter, smaller, and more susceptible to the coughs and fevers that swept through the nursery. Court physicians, steeped in the medical theories of the day, would have prescribed rest, nourishing broths, and fresh air, all while logging her progress in meticulous, respectful notes. But no remedy could address the underlying genetic storm brewing within her. This is where Maria Anna's story shifts from a generalized frailty to a specific, terrifying, and lesser-known medical reality. Historical records, though scarce, are consistent on one point. Her death was attributed to epileptic convulsions. This diagnosis is a crucial key, unlocking a deeper understanding of her suffering and its direct link to her genetic heritage. Today, modern science has established a clear link between consanguinity and a higher prevalence of idiopathic epilepsy, a neurological disorder characterized by seizures with no clear external cause. For Maria Anna, her pure bloodline had rendered her brain exquisitely vulnerable to these chaotic electrical storms. Imagine for a moment the terror of this condition in the 1830s. Epilepsy was profoundly misunderstood, shrouded in superstition and fear. It was not seen as a neurological condition, but often as a sign of divine punishment, demonic possession, or symptom of tainted blood leading to madness. A seizure, a grand mal convulsion, was a violent and terrifying event to witness. The sudden loss of consciousness, the rigid muscles, the uncontrollable shaking, the potential for injury. For a child, it would have been bewildering. For her attendants, it would have been a moment of sheer panic. For her mother, Sophie, it must have been an agony beyond words. Each seizure would have been a stark, physical manifestation of the vulnerability she carried within her, a horrifying confirmation that something was fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. As Maria Anna grew, these seizures may have become more frequent or severe, her small body struggling to cope with the neurological misfirings. This would have cast a pall over the nursery. Her playtime would be monitored with anxious vigilance. Her diet, her sleep, her every activity would be scrutinized for potential triggers based on the flawed medical knowledge of the time. This wasn't just a physical ailment, it was a deeply stigmatizing one. It was the kind of family secret that, even within the highest echelons of the aristocracy, would have been spoken of in hushed tones, if at all. This wasn't a noble illness. It was a frightening, unpredictable affliction that defied the Habsburg image of imperial strength and divine right. This brings us to one of the most compelling and debated questions in Habsburg history. Did they know? Were they, as a dynasty, aware that their centuries-old marriage strategy was the direct cause of their physical and genetic decline, or were they simply tragically ignorant, blaming bad luck or God's will? The answer is complex and lies somewhere in the middle. On one hand, they absolutely lacked our modern understanding of genetics, DNA, and recessive genes. They couldn't have drawn a Punnett square or calculated an inbreeding coefficient. The scientific framework to explain why this was happening simply did not exist. However, they were not blind. They could see the patterns. They were acutely aware of the Habsburg jaw, which was so common it was seen as a familial trademark, a visible sign of their lineage. While sometimes joked about, it was also a clear hereditary physical trait that they knew came from their intermarrying. They were also painfully aware of the high rates of infant mortality, the frail constitutions, and the instances of severe disability that plagued their line. The tragic story of Charles II of Spain, who lived nearly 2 centuries earlier, was a well-known, if horrifying, part of their family history. He was the end of their Spanish line, a king so physically and mentally incapacitated by generations of inbreeding that he could barely speak or walk, and whose death plunged Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession. They knew their line could produce such tragic outcomes, yet they continued the practice. Why? Because to them, the political and dynastic advantages outweighed the biological risks. Preserving the purity of their bloodline and consolidating their vast territories was the paramount duty. A frail child, a stillbirth, even a disabled heir, was seen as a tragic but acceptable price to pay for maintaining the integrity of the dynasty. It was a cold, harsh calculation, but one that had defined their survival for centuries. They likely viewed these health issues as a form of degeneration, a weakness in the blood that was an unfortunate but unavoidable side effect of their unique status, rather than a direct, preventable consequence of their own choices. Furthermore, there was a profound sense of fatalism and religious piety. These tragedies were often interpreted as God's will, crosses to be borne with imperial dignity. To question the marriage practices would be to question the very foundation of their dynastic strategy, and by extension their entire worldview. It was easier and more politically expedient to pray, to rely on physicians, and to mourn in private than to confront the systemic, self-inflicted nature of their problem. And in a tragic, almost Shakespearean twist of irony, Maria Anna's mother, Sophie, was a Wittelsbach. The Wittelsbach dynasty of Bavaria had its own notorious history of eccentricity and mental instability, which would later manifest spectacularly in Sophie's nephew, King Ludwig II of Bavaria. While Sophie herself was remarkably robust, intelligent, and sane, she too carried a complex genetic heritage. Her marriage to her first cousin, Franz Karl, was therefore a compounding of two aristocratic bloodlines, both of which carried their own unique vulnerabilities. Sophie, in her relentless ambition for her children, may have been willfully blind to the genetic gamble she was taking. She was a product of her class and time. A cousin marriage was not just normal, it was preferred. The idea that this choice could lead to such profound suffering in her own child was likely a truth too terrible and too subversive to consciously accept. The final chapter of Maria Anna's short life unfolded in the harsh winter of 1840. By this point, she was 4 years old, and her condition had likely worsened. On February 13, 1840, in the Hofburg Palace, she suffered her final fatal convulsion. In the cold, formal language of the court, her death would have been announced with solemnity and decorum. But behind the closed doors of the imperial apartments, the reality was one of raw, human grief. We can only imagine the scene. The frantic ringing for physicians, the desperate, useless remedies, the terror in her attendants' eyes, and finally, the devastating stillness. For her father, the gentle and unassuming Franz Karl, the loss of his only daughter would have been a deep, personal sorrow. For her brothers, young Franz Joseph, just 9 years old, and his younger siblings, Max and Karl Ludwig, the death of their sister, however frail she may have been, would have been their first stark encounter with mortality, a somber lesson in the fragility of life, even for an archduchess. But the emotional core of this tragedy undoubtedly rests with her mother, Sophie. This was the woman who had already staked her entire life's ambition on her sons. How did this imperfect daughter and her subsequent death fit into Sophie's iron-willed worldview? It's likely she experienced a complex storm of emotions, the profound universal grief of a mother losing her child, a sense of crushing failure that despite all her power and influence, she could not protect her daughter, and perhaps even a hidden, terrible shame, a fear that her daughter's affliction was a stain on the family's image. And here we must add a final heartbreaking detail, a hidden story that dramatically compounds the tragedy and underscores the relentless toll of the Habsburg genetic legacy. When Maria Anna died in February 1840, Archduchess Sophie was already several months pregnant with her 5th child. The stress and grief of losing her daughter, piled on top of the physical demands of pregnancy, must have been overwhelming. Just 3 months later, on May 24th, 1840, Sophie went into labor and delivered a son who was stillborn. This is a tragedy of almost unimaginable proportions. In the span of just over 3 months, Sophie, the formidable only man at court, had buried one child and delivered another dead. The loss of Maria Anna was not an isolated event. It was the first blow in a rapid, 1-2 punch of obstetric and genetic disaster. This compounded grief offers us the deepest, most human insight into the price of pure bloodlines. It strips away the imperial trappings and reveals the raw personal suffering of a woman caught in a system she championed, but whose biological consequences she was forced to bear in the most intimate, painful way possible. The imperial crypt in Vienna, where Maria Anna was laid to rest, didn't just hold the body of a 4-year-old girl. It held the silent, devastating proof of a dynasty's dangerous inheritance. This confluence of loss, burying an epileptic daughter only to suffer a stillbirth 3 months later, is the emotional epicenter of the story. It is the moment where inbreeding ceases to be a political strategy and becomes a raw, immediate human agony. This personal catastrophe had a profound and rippling aftermath, not just for the family, but for the scientific understanding of the Habsburg curse itself. Let's begin with the person most profoundly changed by this, Archduchess Sophie. To understand the impact of these deaths, we must understand the woman. Sophie was not a soft, sentimental figure. She was a woman of formidable intelligence, razor-sharp political acumen, and a deep, almost religious belief in the divine right and dynastic destiny of the House of Habsburg. Her ambition was not primarily for herself, but for her bloodline, and specifically for her eldest son, Franz Joseph. In her husband, Franz Karl, she saw a gentle, kindly man, but one utterly lacking the steel required to rule an empire teetering on the brink of revolution. Her life's mission, therefore, was to bypass her husband and place her perfect son, Franz Joseph, on the throne. He was her project, her vessel, her entire purpose. Now place the double tragedy of 1840 into this mindset. The death of Maria Anna, especially from a condition like epilepsy, was not just a mother's grief. It was a dynastic flaw. Epilepsy, as we discussed, was a deeply stigmatized condition, associated with madness, tainted blood, and hereditary weakness. For a woman obsessed with the strength and purity of her line, her daughter's affliction would have been a source of private terror and perhaps a deep, gnawing shame. It was a crack in the imperial facade she was trying so desperately to maintain. When Maria Anna died, a part of Sophie's grief might have been mingled with a terrible, unutterable relief that this flaw had been hidden from the public eye by death. But then, the stillbirth. This was a different, more visceral blow. This was not a weak child. This was a failed child. It was a failure of her own body, her body which was supposed to be the very font of the dynasty's future. For a woman of such indomitable will, this biological betrayal must have been maddening. It proved she was not infallible. It proved that despite her intelligence and ambition, she was subject to the same frailties she so despised. In the span of 3 months, she had produced one imperfect child who died and one who never even lived. What does this kind of trauma do to a person like Sophie? It does not soften them. It hardens them. It makes them more fervent, more obsessive, more ruthless. This double loss almost certainly acted as a psychological forge, burning away any remaining sentimentality and focusing her ambition for her surviving sons into a white-hot point. Her 3 living boys, Franz Joseph, Max, and Karl Ludwig, became infinitely more precious. Their health, their education, their security became her singular obsession. Every cough, every stumble would have sent a jolt of panic through her. She had seen how quickly the line could falter, how fragile these vessels of the dynasty truly were. This, arguably, is what created the Emperor Franz Joseph we know from history. His rigid, austere, almost fanatically dutiful personality was shaped by a mother terrified of loss. She raised him not to be a happy child, but to be an invulnerable emperor. He was taught to suppress emotion, to prize duty above all, to survive because, as his mother knew all too well, survival was not guaranteed, even for a Habsburg. The ghost of Maria Anna and her stillborn brother didn't just haunt the imperial nursery. They laid the psychological foundation for the entire 68-year reign of Franz Joseph I. Sophie's grief was channeled directly into political action, culminating in 1848, when, during the Revolution, she masterminded the abdication of her brother-in-law, Emperor Ferdinand I, and the renunciation of her own husband, Franz Karl, to place her 18-year-old son, Franz Joseph, on the throne. This was the act of a woman who would let nothing, not revolution, not protocol, and certainly not the grief that had nearly broken her, stand in the way of her dynastic mission. And what of the father, Archduke Franz Karl? He is a more spectral figure in this drama. Described by all as kind, mild-mannered, and unambitious, his grief was likely of a purer, more personal kind. He had lost his only daughter. Where Sophie saw a dynastic flaw, he simply saw his little girl. But in the power dynamic of this marriage, his grief was irrelevant. He was a passive observer. He had no political power to assert, no grand ambitions to channel his loss into. This double tragedy would have only underscored his own helplessness. He could not protect his daughter from her illness. He could not console his wife in a way that mattered to her, and he could not lead the empire. Maria Anna's death and the subsequent stillbirth likely pushed him further into the shadows of his own home, a gentle, grieving man completely eclipsed by his wife's ferocious will to power. He became a footnote in his own family's story, a mere biological necessity for the creation of an emperor. Finally, we must consider the siblings. In 1840, Franz Joseph was 9, Ferdinand Max was 7, and Karl Ludwig was 6. The death of a sibling, especially a younger sister, is a profound event in any child's life. For these boys, living in the insulated, emotionally sterile environment of the court, it was a brutal, early lesson in the fragility of their own existence. They learned that being a Habsburg did not make you immune to death. They would have seen their mother, the most powerful person in their world, shattered by grief, and then watched her rebuild herself into something even more formidable and demanding. This teaches a child a complex lesson about emotion, that grief is a dangerous weakness that must be conquered and converted into action. Franz Joseph learned this lesson well, becoming the famously stoic, unfeeling emperor. Max, more sensitive and romantic, perhaps internalized it differently, developing a melancholy streak and a what-if worldview that would later lead him to his own tragic destiny as the doomed emperor of Mexico. This private psychological trauma reverberated far beyond the walls of the Habsburg. It leads us directly to the great, uncomfortable controversy of the Habsburgs, the curse of inbreeding. For centuries, this was a matter of court gossip, of rival nations pointing to the Habsburg jaw or the mad Spanish kings as proof of their degeneracy. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, this gossip has been replaced by cold, hard, scientific fact. Maria Anna's tragedy was not an isolated incident. It was the predictable, statistically inevitable result of a centuries-long genetic experiment. To understand the scale of this, we must look at the most extreme example. We must travel back in time to the other, more famous branch of the family, the Spanish Habsburgs. The case study that proves the entire thesis is the last of their line, King Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, Charles II was the tragic endpoint of Habsburg inbreeding. He was not just the product of 1 or 2 cousin marriages. He was the culmination of 16 generations of systematic inbreeding, a family tree so tightly wound it more closely resembles a tangled knot than a branching tree. His parents were Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. Not only were they uncle and niece, but Mariana herself was the daughter of Philip's sister. This means Charles II's mother was also his first cousin. His grandmother was also his aunt. The genetic tangle is bewildering. The result was a biological catastrophe. Modern geneticists, most notably a team from the University of Santiago de Compostela, led by Dr. Gonzalo Alvarez, have scientifically calculated Charles II's inbreeding coefficient. This coefficient measures the probability that an individual will receive two identical copies of a gene from an ancestor, one from each parent. For the child of unrelated parents is effectively 0. For the child of first cousins is 0.0625. For the child of a brother, sister, or parent-child union is 0.25. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was 0.254. He was genetically more inbred than a child born to their own sibling. The consequences were devastating, as Charles was a living collection of hereditary Habsburg afflictions, magnified to a horrifying degree. His physical deformities were profound. He had the Habsburg jaw so severe that his upper and lower teeth could not meet, rendering him unable to chew his food properly and causing him to drool constantly. Compounding this, his tongue was so large that his speech was barely intelligible. This physical frailty extended to his entire body. He was an incredibly weak child who couldn't walk until he was 8 years old and remained small, weak, and thin his entire life, constantly beset by illnesses, fevers, and digestive problems. The issues were neurological as well. Like Maria Anna, he suffered from seizures and was also severely cognitively impaired, often described by court observers as simple-minded and childlike. But most critically for the dynasty, he was impotent and sterile. Despite 2 politically arranged marriages, he produced no heir. He was known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because the public and even the court could not believe such a person was a product of nature. They assumed he was the victim of a demonic curse. When he finally died in 1700, just before his 39th birthday, his autopsy report stated his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, and his head was full of water. It was a body that had, quite literally, collapsed under the weight of its own genetic code. And here is the crucial link from personal tragedy to geopolitical catastrophe. Charles II's death without an heir immediately triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. This massive continent-spanning conflict lasted for 13 years and drew in every major European power, killing an estimated 700,000 to 1 million people. The Habsburgs' obsession with keeping power in the family had in the end produced an heir so genetically broken he couldn't continue the line, plunging all of Europe into a devastating war to pick up the pieces. Now let's connect this back to Maria Anna. Her Austrian branch of the family, the Habsburg-Lorraine, was less inbred than the extinct Spanish branch. They had brought in new blood from the House of Lorraine. But the old habits died hard. Maria Anna's parents were first cousins. Her grandparents were also first cousins. The pattern, while diluted, continued. Her epilepsy, her frailty, her early death, these are not the same as Charles II's severe disabilities, but they are symptoms of the exact same underlying problem. They are different rolls of the same heavily loaded genetic dice. Charles II was a 25.4% probability of inheriting 2 identical genes. Maria Anna's parents gave her a 6.25% probability, on top of the probability inherited from their parents. She was a victim of the same dynastic choice, a quieter 19th century echo of the same genetic curse. The controversy, then, is no longer a controversy. It is a scientifically proven fact. The 2009 study by the University of Santiago de Compostela did not just calculate Charles II's inbreeding coefficient. They analyzed the genealogies of 16 Habsburg monarchs and over 3,000 family members across 20 generations. They meticulously cross-referenced these family trees with historical portraits and records of health. Their findings were conclusive, establishing direct, statistically significant correlations. They found a direct correlation between the inbreeding coefficient and the severity of the Habsburg jaw. Put simply, the more inbred a ruler was, the more severe the Habsburg jaw was, more pronounced their jaw deformity, serving as a visible, measurable marker of genetic homozygosity. More grimly, they found a devastating correlation between inbreeding and child mortality. By analyzing the survival rates of 533 Habsburg children, they found a clear pattern. The survival probability was dramatically lower for children born from consanguineous marriages compared to those from non-consanguineous marriages within the same family. This study, published in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS1, moved the Habsburg story from the realm of historical speculation to that of established medical genetics. It is the smoking gun. It proves quantitatively that the Habsburgs were actively breeding themselves into decline. Of course, historians must be nuanced. Not every health problem a Habsburg suffered was due to inbreeding. People in the 19th century died from typhoid, cholera, and smallpox. Medical care was by modern standards primitive, but the pattern is undeniable. As the Spanish study proved, Habsburg child mortality was significantly higher than that of contemporary non-royal families, even though the royals had infinitely better food, sanitation, and access to physicians. This discrepancy can only be explained by a powerful internal hereditary factor. Archduchess Maria Anna is the human face of this statistic. She is the one in 3 Habsburg children who didn't make it to their 10th birthday. She is the personal cost of the political calculus that created Charles II. Her small, seizure-racked body and her mother's subsequent stillbirth were not God's will or bad luck. They were the statistical foreseeable outcomes of a dynastic strategy that, in its relentless pursuit of power, was actively consuming its own children. This collision of private grief and cold, hard science reveals a predictable, tragic pattern. But the consequences of this deeply embedded genetic fragility did not end in the nursery. They rippled outward, shaping the personalities of emperors, shattering the line of succession, and, in a final terrible irony, contributing to the very collapse of the 600-year-old empire the Habsburgs had sacrificed their children's health to maintain. To see these consequences in action, we need only look at the man who was on the throne at the very moment Maria Anna was born and died, Emperor Ferdinand I. Ferdinand was the brother of Maria Anna's father, Franz Karl. He was her uncle, and he was in many ways a living, breathing, public manifestation of the very same genetic issues that claimed his young niece in private. Ferdinand reigned from 1835 to 1848, but reigned is a generous term. Like Maria Anna, Ferdinand suffered from severe epilepsy, enduring as many as 20 seizures a day. He also had hydrocephalus, a speech impediment, and significant developmental disabilities. Ferdinand was known with a mixture of pity and contempt as Ferdinand the Benign or the Good. He was a kind-hearted man but completely incapable of ruling the vast, complex, and simmering Austrian Empire. His famous, and perhaps apocryphal, quote upon being told by his cook he couldn't have his preferred apricot dumplings out of season: "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings," perfectly encapsulates his childlike mind, trapped within the body of a monarch. Because of his incapacity, the empire was actually run by a secret state conference, a council led by Prince Metternich, along with Maria Anna's father, Franz Karl, and their brother, Archduke Ludwig. This is a crucial point. The Habsburg genetic crisis was no longer just a private sorrow in the nursery. It was a public power vacuum at the very top of the empire. Ferdinand's weakness, a direct result of the same inbreeding that affected Maria Anna, is what allowed, and indeed forced, our formidable Archduchess Sophie to become the only man at court. She stepped into the void her brother-in-law's disability created, maneuvering relentlessly to protect the dynasty. And when the revolutions of 1848 swept across Europe and hit Vienna, Ferdinand was hopelessly overwhelmed. He was incapable of handling the crisis. It was this moment of extreme peril that Sophie seized. In a brilliant, ruthless political masterstroke, she convinced her brother-in-law, Ferdinand, to abdicate the throne. But she did not allow her own husband, the mild-mannered Franz Karl, to take it. She forced him to renounce his own right to succession, bypassing him entirely. Why? So she could place her 18-year-old perfect son, Franz Joseph, on the imperial throne. This is the first major earth-shattering consequence. The genetic flaw, manifesting as epilepsy and disability in both Ferdinand and Maria Anna, directly caused the abdication of one emperor and the unprecedented rise of another, all orchestrated by a mother who had just witnessed the lethal cost of that same flaw. Sophie, having seen the genetic weakness in her own daughter and in the reigning emperor, reacted not by changing the dynastic strategy, but by doubling down on the one son she believed was strong enough to survive it. The trauma of 1840 didn't teach her to stop the inbreeding. It taught her to be more ruthless in managing its consequences. And what was one of the first and most important tasks for the new young emperor Franz Joseph? To secure the next generation, to marry and produce an heir. And who did his mother Sophie, the woman who had watched her epileptic daughter die and then delivered a stillborn son, choose for him? She chose her own niece, Helene, the daughter of her sister, Princess Ludovica of Bavaria. In other words, after all that tragedy, her grand solution was another first cousin marriage. It is a staggering, almost incomprehensible decision from a modern perspective, but it shows how completely she was trapped within the dynastic ideology. Pure blood and political alliances, even with their known lethal risks, were still the only tools she trusted. As fate would have it, history took a famously romantic, though genetically identical detour. When the 23-year-old Franz Joseph traveled to meet his intended bride, the quiet 18-year-old Helene, he found himself instantly captivated by her fiery, beautiful 15-year-old younger sister, Elizabeth of Bavaria, known to history as Sisi. In a rare act of personal defiance, he rejected his mother's carefully laid plan and declared he would marry Sisi, or no one at all. It's painted as one of the 19th century's great royal love stories. But here is the devastating genetic irony. Sisi was also his first cousin. He had simply swapped one first cousin for another. He was still marrying his mother's sister's daughter, his first cousin. He was still doubling down on the combined genetic vulnerabilities of the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbachs. The romantic choice was just another move within the same closed, inescapable genetic trap. And what was the result of this great love story, this union of two first cousins, one of whom was the son of a mother who had lost two children to hereditary frailties? The result was an almost perfect, heartbreaking echo of the tragedy of Maria Anna. Franz Joseph and Sisi's first child was a daughter, born in 1855. They named her Archduchess Sophie after her formidable grandmother. From birth, the child was noted as frail. Sisi was a young, anxious mother, and her mother-in-law, the elder Sophie, was a domineering, critical grandmother who constantly interfered, believing Sisi was too flighty and neurotic to raise an heir properly. The two women clashed terribly over the care of the child. Then, in 1857, while on a state visit to Hungary, the 2-year-old Archduchess Sophie fell ill with a fever and diarrhea, likely typhoid, but her underlying frail constitution made her especially vulnerable. She died in a matter of days. The death of this child, the granddaughter named for the grandmother, was a catastrophe that destroyed a generation. For Sisi, it was the event that broke her. She plunged into a deep, profound depression from which she arguably never recovered. She blamed herself, she blamed her husband, and she blamed the stifling, suffocating world of the Habsburg court. This tragedy was the catalyst for her lifelong flight from Vienna, her obsessive preoccupation with her own beauty and health, her anorexia, and her profound, crushing melancholy. The tragic empress persona, the icon of sorrow we remember today, was forged in the grief of losing her first child, a child who, like her Aunt Maria Anna before her, was a victim of the same repeating pattern of infant fragility in a dangerously inbred line. The consequences continued to cascade, leading to the dynasty's ultimate unraveling. The next child of Franz Joseph and Sisi, the one who truly mattered, was the new heir, Crown Prince Rudolf. Rudolf was the product of this entire tangled, tragic legacy. He was the son of two first cousins. He inherited the rigid, unfeeling sense of duty from his Habsburg father and the deep, romantic, unstable melancholy of his Wittelsbach mother. Rudolf was, in short, a psychological perfect storm. He was highly intelligent, sensitive, and held liberal political views that were the total opposite of his deeply conservative father's. He was trapped in an unhappy marriage, stifled by the court, and suffered from profound, debilitating bouts of depression. On January 30th, 1889, at the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Mayerling, the 30-year-old Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son and sole heir to the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire, shot his 17-year-old mistress, Mary Vetsera, before shooting himself. This was the Mayerling incident. It was not just a tabloid scandal, it was a dynastic cataclysm. The direct line of succession was shattered. How can we separate this act from the genetic legacy that produced Rudolf? It's impossible. Was it the pressure of his father? Yes. Was it his political isolation? Yes. But it was also indisputably a mind predisposed to instability, depression, and obsessive behavior, the very Wittelsbach melancholy and Habsburg intensity that came from his dangerously intertwined family tree. The genetic curse that had manifested as epilepsy in Maria Anna and Ferdinand, and as frailty in the infant Sophie, now manifested in the heir to the throne as a depression so deep it ended his own life and the future of his dynasty. And this, my friends, is where this private genetic story explodes onto the world stage, with consequences that would change the 20th century forever. Rudolf's death at Mayerling created a massive succession crisis, as the throne could no longer pass from Franz Joseph to his son. By law, the succession passed to Franz Joseph's brothers. His first brother, Ferdinand Maximilian, would have been next in line, but he had already been executed in Mexico in 1867. Therefore, the succession passed to Franz Joseph's next brother, Karl Ludwig. Karl Ludwig was a pious, unassuming man, but he died in 1896 from typhoid. Consequently, the succession ultimately passed to Karl Ludwig's eldest son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is the name we all know, because Rudolf, the product of inbreeding, killed himself at Mayerling. A new, unlikely heir was created, an heir who was known for his fiery temper and his controversial non-royal marriage, an heir who was deeply unpopular in many circles, an heir who on June 28, 1914, traveled to the unstable city of Sarajevo to inspect imperial troops. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie by a Serbian nationalist was the spark that ignited the First World War. Let that sink in. The chain of events is direct and chilling. The genetic instability of the Habsburg line, a product of centuries of inbreeding, created a crown prince who was psychologically incapable of bearing his role and who took his own life. His suicide directly altered the line of succession, placing his cousin, Franz Ferdinand, in the crosshairs of history. The gunshots in Sarajevo that began World War I were, in a very real sense, the final terrible echo of the tragedy at Mayerling. And what did World War I do? It utterly destroyed the Habsburgs. In 1918, after 641 years of rule, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved. The dynasty was finished. The empire they had sacrificed their children's health to preserve, the empire they had inbred for centuries to consolidate, was gone. The very tool they had used to build their power, strategic, consanguineous marriage, had in the end created the biological instability that directly contributed to their final political ruin. So now we return. We return from the battlefields of World War I, from the blood-stained lodge at Mayerling, from the glittering tragic court of Sisi, and we go back to that quiet, dark room in the Hofburg Palace in 1840. We return to the small 4-year-old girl whose story we began with, Archduchess Maria Anna of Austria, born in 1835, died in 1840. A life of just 4 years, 3 months, and 17 days. A life lived in the shadow of a grand palace defined by an illness that no one understood but everyone feared. She is a footnote in history, her name barely registering next to the titans of her family. But her story, as we have seen, is not a footnote. It is the preface. It is the key. It is the Rosetta Stone that unlocks the entire tragic secret of the Habsburg dynasty. Her small seizure-racked body was a warning, a quiet, desperate alarm bell that the dynasty's pursuit of pure blood was a biological fallacy, a path to ruin. Her death and the stillbirth that followed was the personal human cost of a political ideology. Her mother, Sophie, ignored that warning. Her brother, Franz Joseph, repeated the mistake, and the consequences played out generation by generation with the grim, unstoppable logic of a Greek tragedy, the death of the infant Archduchess Sophie, the suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the end of an empire. All of it is connected by a tangled, broken thread of DNA back to the same dynastic obsession that claimed Maria Anna. The Habsburgs left the world an incredible legacy of art, music, and architecture. Their palaces still dominate the skylines of Vienna, Prague, and Budapest, but they also left this other, more cautionary tale. A lesson that no dynasty, no matter how powerful, no matter how pure, is immune to the fundamental laws of biology. A reminder that empires are not just maps and treaties. They are families, made of fragile human beings. Maria Anna's life was a whisper in the grand operatic history of her family. But if we listen closely, that whisper tells the whole devastating truth, that in their relentless quest to be more than human, they forgot the simple, vital wisdom of what it means to be human at all.